Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Loosely Coupled by Bridging the Gap. My name is Karol Skrzynski, and I'll be your host tonight. And I've been recently told that this sounds like Good Morning Vietnam. So, for those who know the movie, well, that's a great comedy. So, hopefully, it doesn't sound as like that. So, we'll see. Anyways, hope you got your refreshments for tonight. I got myself some coffee with tonic. Summertime, you know. And tonight, before we jump into the topic, a bit of an announcement. So, if you're new here, if you haven't been with us before, well, of course, we invite you to go visit bridgingthegapeu.com to see what we're up to in terms of knowledge base articles, etc. But the important thing is, we just launched with Avans Coperta, another instance of our strategic integration design with DDD. So it's now available to be bought at an early bird price. Feel free to visit the QR code. And of course, if you haven't been here before, you just tuned in to the beginning of the stream because LinkedIn or YouTube popped you a notification, scan the QR code with the subscribe to YouTube channel. We are doing this quite often, at least 3 times a month. So tune in for the next one as well. And today, oh, I see my screen lost connection. Today, we're talking about education. Education in the age of AI, education in IT, how to get young professionals into the job where we're lacking spots for young professionals because companies are starting to just remove junior positions because of AI or because of other crazy aspects. And to talk about this, we have tonight with us Chelsea Troy. Amongst being an engineer at Mozilla, she's also an adjunct associate professor at the University of Chicago. So, Chelsea, welcome to the stream.
Hi, folks. Happy to be here.
So, Chelsea, a bit of your background, please, so people know who you are, because of course the DD community will know, but not everybody. You're US based, so in Europe that might be a bit of a tricky thing. Who the hell is this gal, and what is she doing here? Tell us.
Sure. Yeah. So I work as a machine learning operations engineer at Mozilla. We make a browser called Firefox. That's my day job. And then I also teach at the University of Chicago, as Carol mentioned. I teach in the graduate program. So chiefly folks who already have their undergraduate degree and they are now going for their master's in computer science. I teach classes on programming there, and I also teach classes on machine learning, generally applied statistical learning, as well as a couple of electives from time to time. So I like to call it lovingly my night job, kind of. And then I do some professional workshops through O'Reilly as well.
Yeah, so kind of like my night job being bridging the gap and doing these live streams and teaching classes at Avans Coperta and DD Academy. Yeah, that's pretty much
Exactly.
it.
Although I have seen you do work on those things at conferences during the day, all kinds of places.
Yeah, well, conferences are a special occasion. That's a different story, right? You're also not working at Mozilla when you're at conferences. You're also doing conferences, right?
That's
So,
true.
so while it's probably would be an extremely interesting topic to talk about Mozilla and machine learning in terms of Firefox, because a lot of people use Firefox, obviously. We're not talking about Mozilla today, maybe another time. But we're talking about education. And me, after being 15 years in IT, I know that my university did not prepare me for IT at all, but that's also given that I studied electrical engineering, not computer science. That is
Sure.
fair to say that they couldn't. But at least I know how to program in logic gates and assembler.
Always a good skill to have.
Might come useful in a zombie apocalypse or something. I don't know. We'll see. Either way, I think that the education space has changed. I mean, the market for junior professionals, young professionals, has changed a lot in the recent years. And at least what I'm seeing as a senior consultant and architect is that, well, people come to do the job. At times, they're very well prepared if they're passionate about the topics that they're doing. Otherwise, it varies. And
Right.
always varied, but I don't think that to this extent. So, from your perspective as an educator, as a professor in a university, what is the problem space of education today in terms of preparing young people for a role in IT?
Sure. I think that I've been teaching since 2019. And so I've seen a few years now of folks coming through and working towards getting their first roles in industry. And I think in part, the shift that I have seen has had to do with a number of factors that kind of led up to where we are now. There's, of course, kind of AI, and we're absolutely going to get there and we're going to talk about that. But even before that, I started in 2019, which would have been the spring of 2019, well before pandemic lockdowns and what have you. And when I started teaching, I was teaching graduate students who primarily had their undergraduate degree in something else and had gone to work. They had been in the working world for some number of years already. While they were in the working world, they had accomplished various things. Maybe they'd become a manager or gotten promoted or whatever, and somehow decided that now they wanted to change careers. And they went back to receive a master's degree in computer science in order to prepare to change careers. And so, not all,
Hmm.
but many of the students that I was teaching already had some work experience, already had some applicable skills from having worked professionally in another field, and also had some expertise in something other than computer science that they had used in whatever field that they were coming from before. As time has progressed, a larger proportion of the students in my classes are coming directly from undergrad. And I think that happens for a couple of reasons. I think one of the reasons it has happened is that there was this sort of like during the pandemic period where hiring or getting hired felt like a very scary thing to do. Actual hiring rates were a little volatile at the time. And so a number of folks decided, as frequently happens during, for example, a recession, folks with the means will come out of an undergraduate program and say, I'm going to go and get a graduate degree now. This seems like the appropriate time. It seems like my return on investment of trying to get a job right now is going to be relatively lower. And so I think that that's part of the changes that I have seen is that piece of it. I think there's another piece of it, however, which is the pandemic lockdowns themselves. I think that folks who were in currently students who are receiving master's degrees, who are in my master's programs, the lockdown happened like somewhere between their junior year of high school. So for folks who are in Europe, this is the second to last year of high school
Hmm.
in the United States before you go into an undergraduate or university program. It happened somewhere between there and the beginning of their university career. And so these are
Hmm.
folks who grew up, right? Elementary school, middle school, the beginning of what we call high school, with teachers telling them about the experience that college was going to be and how they were going to go to this place and they were going to make all these friends. They were going to live in these dorms. They were going to figure out what they wanted to do with their lives, which I think has always been false when we tell people that they're going to figure out what they want to do with their lives in university. However, they've been told all of these stories about what this beginning of sort of like post high school education is going to look like for them. Then lockdown happens. They do not receive that experience. They spend the entirety of that time on a screen, a lot of times in their homes. They are not learning in person at university. Sometimes they didn't even graduate high school in person. And so these are students who feel that they have, and understandably, missed out on an experience that they were told about for the entirety of their lives leading up to that point. And so I think for some of them, part of the impetus for going directly to graduate school is now I get to learn in person. I get to have a facsimile of that experience that I was told I was going to have that I missed. And I want to go back and I want to get that experience. And so I think that that's also a part of it. But another thing that happened during that period is that this lockdown period, it was traumatic for students. It was traumatic for teachers. It was traumatic for administrators. A lot of universities had to go online with like 6 days notice. People didn't have training in this. Administrators had not administered something like this before. You had teachers like rolling whiteboards into their living room in front of their Zoom camera so that they could teach on their laptop math or whatever. And so this was a period during which I think a lot of our standards for what we expected of students and teachers got relaxed. And I don't necessarily think that that's an indication that we were derelict in our duty. I think this was a deeply traumatic period of a lot of change for a lot of people. And we really didn't have a choice but to change things quite a bit. But I do think that students coming out of university, having done it during the pandemic, got a very different experience than the one that most universities were set up to provide them. And so when students come into my classes now, a lot of the experiences that I would sort of have expected graduate students to have in the past are not experiences that they have had. They have not, for example, stayed up late at a library going through tomes because they're preparing for some research project, some presentation. A lot of them have not worked in labs the way that they might have if they had done undergrad in person like that. There are also a lot of like study skills that I think we were much more rigorous about verifying pre-pandemic that during that period we were not verifying. And so students are coming in not only not necessarily having all of the skills that they might have had if they had received the education universities were prepared to provide, but also not even necessarily being aware that those are expectations. And so this is
Mm.
a thing that I have found myself figuring out how to grapple with in the classes. And it's not students' faults, it's not necessarily teachers' faults either. But I think that due to the fact that we are in this period immediately after this period of an enormous amount of change that universities were wholly unprepared for, there's a question of what exactly went missing during that period. And I think, the jury's still out on this. The research is still being done on this. But
Hmm.
personally, what I see is that students generally arrive in my classroom today uh, with less work experience on average than they had in 2019, and also with fewer of what I would consider the canonical study experiences than they maybe
Okay.
had pre-pandemic. And I think that what has happened due to the timing of that lockdown relative to the advent of AI products being available for consumers is that students then arrive at a graduate program. They're being told that AI is taking their jobs. They feel like they need to overperform in order to be able to get a job in a modern market. And so they tend to oversubscribe. Let's say that a full-time course load is 3 courses. Students will take 4 courses and pick up an internship and pick up a research thing. They're trying to do all of these responsibilities simultaneously in order to appear competitive in what they understand to be an extremely competitive environment for getting a job. And when they're trying to oversubscribe and do all of these things, once upon a time, pre AI, what they would do is they would try to manage this for like 9 months, kind of burn out, and then they need to make a choice to step back, take on less, take some rest, what have you. Whereas now, there's this alternative available, which is to attempt to use automated solutions to make some of the work happen more quickly, to make some of the work happen more efficiently. Because we have this idea in tech generally, not just in the university, that efficiency is work being done. And I understand why we have that sort of idea is that like work being done faster means that things are more efficient. But the problem is that when students
I
are in a graduate program, the thing they're trying to achieve is learning. And learning happens best through like inefficient activities where you have to devote a lot of attention to it. And so I think some pieces are getting lost in this like attempt to get things done more efficiently, the availability of tools to make things happen quicker in a way that isn't always necessarily contributing to the skill development.
right. Oof. Now that's a loaded answer.
It
As,
was a lot. I'm sorry about that.
it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. So okay. So we have the unfortunate circumstances of the complete uh, change of environment. Suddenly, we went completely digital for a time being. Uh, Suddenly, we're like not available to socially interact, which impacts a lot of things. Suddenly, we're changing the sources that we're dealing with because the sources are now fully digital instead of being books, libraries that also involve social interactions. And then we have the aspects of people actually coming with a completely different experience, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Because I imagine, I mean, in Poland, where I studied, it's kind of the same. People, when they go to university for bachelor's degrees, by the way, undergrad, I think it means bachelor's, right?
Yep.
in this sense. They often don't have enough money to be self-sufficient without work, so they go to work, get some experience, even if that experience has nothing to do with their field of study, and actually have some understanding of how work is done or how it works. Even if they work at a cafe, that's always something bringing that kind of value and understanding. Oh, this is not that straightforward, right? And then of course now we have the I think that's probably going back to the manufacturing education, right? The classroom preparing people for manufacturing roles rather than for these kind of white collar roles where you need to be you have knowledge based work. So there, so and my brain just lost the thought. So in that sense, they're most of the time we're preparing towards one way of thinking, whereas university already requires a little bit more, especially in master studies, right, graduate studies, and they have not had the chance to experience that to a certain extent, right?
Right. Yeah. They I think folks are coming in, and for a lot of them their first experience of like the working world is going to happen after my class, after they graduate from a graduate program.
Right. So that might be already a humongous challenge for people, right? And then of course we have the efficiency aspect, where I think that if we would be chatting with Barry O'Reilly here, then Barry would say, well, we took too much from traditional engineering. And I think that efficiency aspect of automating work, where we have traditional engineering that requires repeated action, that kind of manufacturing aspect, this would be absolutely true. But when we have knowledge-based jobs, and programming is a knowledge-based job, definitely, we can't automate the whole of it. This requires actual thinking and actual comprehension.
Right.
So then if we start oversimplifying what we do and taking too much, and then trying to bring efficiency through automation without comprehension and reason, then we're having problems. I think that's so. Pretty much the summary of what you said.
I think that there's a number of skills necessary. Well, and I think a thing that happens is that there are professional skills that folks kind of necessarily learn on the job a lot of the time. And this isn't even like programming skills, right? We're talking about time management skills. You have a due date, it's in 9 weeks, and nobody is telling you what to do in week 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How do you manage that type of a situation? That can be a situation that, I mean, that's routine, that's commonplace for us in professional situations. But for folks who are coming out of undergrad, they've never been asked to do that before. That's a new, for a lot of them, experience. And they're used to having more guideposts than that for what's supposed to happen. In graduate programs, a lot of times you'll be asked to do whatever, a master's thesis, or of course a dissertation. And a dissertation in a PhD program is maybe the extreme of this in an academic situation, because a lot of times you're being asked to complete a project over the course of years and you're expected to independently manage that project. You have an advisor, but that kind of independent project management, independent time management, sometimes independent knowledge management. How are you going to learn this? How are you going to organize the information? How are you going to make sure that it's accessible to you in the future? These types of things are new, and they're things that we don't necessarily formally teach folks. And so a lot of times what will happen is they either kind of learn them via a trial by fire approach in university, or they learn them via a trial by fire approach professionally. And I think that trial by fire thing is kind of like happening sometimes in the graduate program when I'm working with these students, or hasn't happened yet and is like about to happen.
Fine, we'll try. I'm trying to like compare and contrast to my own experiences as a student, and I've been in a privileged situation because I had enough money. I didn't have to work, I remember that my work basically started because the university required me to do an internship.
Mm.
And I just didn't stop after the internship. I was like, okay, maybe I should continue because I'm actually learning a lot more than from my curriculum at work. Especially that at the time when I was doing my bachelor's, I already knew that I don't want to be an electrical engineer.
Mm.
So I want to go to computer science. But that was a
So given that
mistake.
your bachelor's is in electrical engineering, it's
Yeah.
there's a priority mismatch.
Yeah, but I was doing my internship in computer science, anyways, right? But I was doing it with a consulting company. Actually, learned some Java for Android at the time. That was a very long time ago. That was, I think, Android 1 or something. And the electrical engineering faculty also had computer science classes in it because they were mandatory, because we also needed to learn how to program PLC drivers, program an elevator, for example. That's part of the curriculum. So basically, we had sufficient amount of knowledge to learn how to code, while at the same time we learned how transistors work and how to build, how to use a amplifier, etc., etc. And I recall a lot of my colleagues were at the time working. Most of them were working already as juniors somewhere, actual in a professional capacity, somewhat aligned with their studies rather than just ad hoc jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So for them, it was kind of easy because they got on into these kind of roles mostly through internships,
Mm.
and they just stayed as juniors. That market was pretty much very different than what it is now. Now, okay, large companies like consulting companies like Capgemini, for which I work, there are young professional programs that the company chooses a bunch of people from a university. They bring them on an internship. Sometimes they stay after the internship, but they already get that kind of work experience.
Mm-hmm.
In Europe, most universities require, as part of the bachelor's program, to have a internship. That internship needs to be like 6 weeks long or more,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they have to go out to different companies, get that internship, and go back to the university to actually graduate. Without the
Mm-hmm.
internship, they cannot really graduate because these are ECTS points that you have for that internship. I have
Mm-hmm.
no idea how that works in US. Is that similar, that the undergrads are required to have internship?
It's not necessarily required. It's certainly desired, as in the student's desire to be able to get an internship, because work
Hmm.
experience is extremely valuable for being able to demonstrate that you're able to do whatever it is that you need to do on the job. And I think that a big part of that, from a pragmatic perspective, is that the assumption, I think, among hiring committees is that work experience gives you precisely some of these skills that we've been talking about: the time management,
Hmm.
the process management, those types of skills, which you aren't necessarily learning in classes that are largely holding your hand as they attempt to teach you the subject matter expertise that you need. Um,
Right.
and I think that students, I mean, and I don't know that this has necessarily changed, because when I was an undergrad, this was many, many years ago at this point, internships were competitive then. Trying to apply to entry level positions was competitive then. I remember that some of
Right.
the advice that I was receiving, back when I was looking for positions at the very beginning of my career, was that cold applying to jobs, and this was before AI. This was like before there was some sort of like automatic resume reviewer thing. Already at that time, the advice was, if you apply cold, probably your resume is not going to get looked at. Probably nobody's even going to see it. So, like, you could apply cold to 100 different places and it might make absolutely no difference. What you need to do is find out about places that you're interested in, meet people at those places, come in referred, have conversations with
Yeah.
people, make impressions, basically more obliquely, and then apply places. And uh, this is something that I talk to students about now, because students will say, well, I applied to 100 places cold, and now I'm not getting any responses, I assume because of an AI reviewer. And the thing,
Not necessarily, right?
right, this might sound uncharitable, but the thing that I'm thinking is, like, 15 years before AI was available, already we were getting no responses from 100 cold applications. That is
True.
not the AI. The reason that you're imagining in your head maybe sounds new, but the phenomenon that you're describing is not new. New graduates have dealt with this for decades. This is how
Yeah,
entering the job market is made. It has never been, I don't know about never. Supposedly, supposedly in the 80s and the 70s it was more of a cakewalk. This is the thing that we talk about, is that, like, our parents were able to have a house and two kids on one salary and a job that they got right out of undergrad, and maybe that was true for some people, maybe it wasn't. I wasn't here, but
yeah,
uh as long as I have known anything about the job market, it has not been a cakewalk. So it's not like,
yeah.
you know it's hard
Uh,
now. It wasn't easy before, in my
yeah,
opinion.
true. I mean, I recall being in high school and my mom telling me constantly that if you get a master's degree, you're guaranteed a job. Nowadays, that's definitely not true. That just doesn't
Right.
happen. The
Right, I
amount
would
of
agree with that.
competition with people that have master's degrees, yeah, they still don't get the job because that's
And I
not
know a
enough.
lot of people who work, they have master's degrees in biology or whatever, and they're in an unrelated field. They're working, you know, some completely separate thing, or they're doing itinerant work or something like that. And they'd like to do something in line with their degree one day, but they're not currently.
Yeah, I mean, I did only a bachelor's in electrical engineering, and I never worked as an electrical engineer.
Yep.
I mean,
And
I
my
have a
bachelor's was
working
in
understanding.
international relations, and I did, although I did some internships in that area, my sort of career thrust doesn't have a lot to do with it.
Right. So basically, this is a theme that's definitely spans about at least 20 years back. That people already had this problem. The previous generation didn't have that problem because that is the post-war generation, that one, the first that actually is prosperous after the war. In Poland, that's even more severe because that's the generation that is the adults after the Berlin Wall, right? So it's out of communism, etc. So that's a completely different reality, and then that reality shifts towards that, you know, capitalist market that is typically known for US, that's been there a longer time than in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, that reality for a lot of people, that's a mismatch. They've been promised something else. They get a completely different experience. Even if they experience of university, they manage to go to university, then them joining a workforce was already, well, difficult,
Mm-hmm.
right? And now we're having a situation where companies are openly saying, oh, we're not hiring juniors because we have AI, which I would say it's a load of crap, because the firing that it happens, AI is only a cover story for a lot of companies, right?
Yeah,
We
we'll
know
get
that.
there. We'll get to this
We'll get
claim here in a second.
right, but then you know, the things that have changed, at least from my perspective, with internet, we already had access to information a lot more than previously. Because if as a teenager, when I wanted information and I had a dial-up modem, yeah, I didn't go to the internet. I went to the library and just sit in the library with a stack of books, which is, by the way, something I still do. Here's my stack of books.
Gosh.
Yeah, doing research, right? So I have a stack of books for research, because I try to clean them up and put them on the shelf, but they come back the next day. So might as well keep them here.
Mm-hmm.
So that was also me in high school, with surrounded by a stack of books and just finding things, because internet was dial up and I couldn't,
Right.
and there was no sites. Wikipedia was still not exactly any source of truth that anybody knew in Poland,
No,
etc.,
I
etc.,
remember
etc.
teachers constantly being like, don't go to Wikipedia. It's full of garbage. And now, like, that's a far cry from where we are today, where on Wikipedia there's so many editors that it's probably correct. And if you try to make it wrong, it'll be fixed within 2 minutes.
Pretty much. But then there was this shift from scouring all sorts of materials just to find the correct information, learning a lot of things along the way, because you had to read a lot just to find the right thing. Now we just ask Google, or even worse nowadays, we ask ChatGPT or any other LLM. We get that information handed to us like that, right? And now I see quite often that people get that information, read that information, and that's it. There is no connecting the dots. That's a skill that somewhere along the way got completely missing. And I don't know what the scale is of this, because obviously I'm not doing educational psychology studies, so I have no means of knowing that. Uh, but it's a noticeable phenomenon that people have access to the information, read that information, and have no idea how to use that information. They
Mm-hmm.
just consume information. That's where it stops.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of people, information equals knowledge and equals wisdom. Uh, from what I can tell, information versus knowledge, there are two different things. Knowledge is actually connecting the dots and understanding the context, and then wisdom is knowing how to further use that in context and or expand outside of the context that you learned it. And I think that access to information started to create a large chasm between that information going to knowledge somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Now the question is, how do you see that from the perspective of the classroom? Is
Right.
that actually the case there?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of things that I want to bring in here. One of them is an idea about how we learn and how we evaluate the depth of the learning that we have done. Because I talk to my students about this progression of skills that they get as their knowledge becomes deeper and more usable in a specific area. And it starts, as you can imagine, with reading, with taking in the information. And then it moves on to memory, memorizing the information, knowing the information. Then it goes to understanding the information. Then it goes to figuring out how to like apply the information, and then finally create with the information, be able to create
So,
something new.
so you basically just explain Bloom's taxonomy.
Yes, yes, exactly. I explain Bloom's taxonomy to them, and we talk about the different skills that they are going to learn in a class, and we also talk about where in Bloom's taxonomy these skills are located. So they have a wheel that they receive at the beginning of the class that explains the skills and explains where we are in that area, and for any given
Mm-hmm.
activity or any given assignment, I can tell them which of these things it's trying to develop, because one of the things that we've learned or one of the things that we have some educational research on that I've been applying anecdotally is that students have an easier time achieving the goal of the assignment when they understand that goal of the assignment ahead of time. And sometimes people will kind of like, people will sort of sardonically put this, that like educational techniques don't work unless you tell students that they're supposed to work or whatever. And I think it's in fact a different thing, which is that when we are priming students' minds to take in the information and do a specific thing with it, that gives them the ability to apply that goal more directly and kind of understand with the goal in mind what they're trying to do, which makes it a little bit easier to do. I think
Mm-hmm.
about this in terms of the wisdom that it's that teaching works best when directed at a mind that is already thinking. And so if we are priming folks to be thinking about this, it's easier for them to intake the same information in the same way that uh I'll draw this comparison. There's this idea in conference talk land that a thing that
Okay.
you should do is tell people what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell people what you already told them. Theoretically,
Yeah,
this is what you're supposed to do. We talk about this, of course, in
and
academic testing.
that pretty much starts with the abstract. Literally, the advice for abstracts for conferences is to tell them what you're going to tell them.
Right. Yes. But what's interesting about this advice is that it then requires you to repeat the information 3 times, which limits the amount of information that you can get in. And it has this effect. The reason that we are told to do it, if we interrogate why we are told to do it, analogies get drawn about, for example, whitewashing a fence. Whitewashing is the way that we would have painted fences back in the day. It's not a very thick or opaque paint, so you have to put over a whole bunch of different coats. And the idea is that, like, if you tell them what you're going to tell them, that's one coat. If you tell them, then that's a second coat. And if you tell them what you told them, that's a third coat. And maybe it gets in. We're doing all this banking
Yeah.
on maybe.
So that's basically on the premise of repetition creates retention.
Right. But I like to think about teaching sometimes in terms of mystery novels.
Okay.
When we read a mystery novel, we are first presented with a problem. Usually the problem in a mystery novel is somebody has been murdered and we don't know who did it.
Mm-hmm.
And then over the course of the story, we receive clues as to what's going on. And experienced readers of mystery novels, dedicated readers of mystery novels, are not just waiting for the story to tell them who has murdered the person at the beginning, right? What they are doing is they themselves are trying to put together the clues. They are attempting
True.
to solve the problem. It's this sort of race. People who are into mystery novels, my mother is one of them, are frequently very auto competitive. And what they are doing with the beginning of each mystery novel is they are entering themselves into a race against the narrator to see if they can figure out the solution to this crime before we get to the end and they are told. Now, does a mystery novel start by telling you who did it and then explain to you all of the clues about who did it and then tell
No.
you who did it? No, it's only got to say it the one time. But it sticks. And the reason that it sticks is that the entirety of the telling of the story is devoted to creating in the reader a need for the information, an interest in the information, a pull towards the information, rather than
Mm-hmm.
pushing it on them over and over and over and hoping that eventually it impinges in their skull. And so frequently when I'm thinking about educational design, I'm thinking about this and the way that getting somebody to understand and apply information is frequently a matter of helping them understand why they need it and then giving them the opportunity to put the pieces together themselves. I was talking to a dance instructor about this recently because we were discussing which pieces of a history of athletic training are
Mm-hmm.
applicable to dance training because they're different things, right? If you're
Okay.
doing strength training, then you're doing sort of the same techniques over and over for the purpose of eventually getting stronger. You can't really think your way into being better at this thing. In dance, the skills are much different. You need coordination. You also need repeated practice. But it's a frequent idea in dance that, like, if I just think harder about the choreo, then I'm going to be able to do it. And to some extent, there's truths to that. There's things about it that are different from strength training, but there are things about it that aren't different as there aren't different that work the same way as well. But from there, the topic, when I was talking to this dance instructor, shifted onto the idea of webbed thinking. Webbed
Okay.
thinking is a skill. It's a skill associated with being able to take something that you have learned in one area of your life and apply it to another area of your life. Now, as with most skills, some people have more inherent talent for this than others. However, because it is a skill, it can be taught, it can be learned, it can be practiced, and anybody can get better at it. And I think
Right.
that this period of time that you're talking about, where we would go through books, we would learn a lot of extraneous information, and then find ourselves applying that extraneous information later in different contexts than the one we learned it. I think that that style of learning tends to uh it helps someone practice webbed thinking in a way that being able to get the exact answer to your question does not necessarily do all of the time. And so while we may be arriving at a more direct answer to the specific question that we had, these oblique references, these ideas that are disparate from the specific question we're asking right now, but that we'll be able to apply later in a different context, our current path to getting an answer to our question involves a lot fewer of those than it used to. And so our facility for webbed thinking, our practice with webbed thinking does not happen automatically as a result of trying to get a question answered today the way that it did once upon a time.
Wow,
By
that's
the
loaded.
way,
Okay.
while we're talking about this, there's a programmer, Avdi Grimm. He used to do, I think still does Ruby Tapas, and now talks a lot about elegant software design.
Mm-hmm.
He lives here in the United States. He lives in St. Louis, but he gave this really wonderful talk at, I want to say it was Southwest Ruby because I think it was in Texas. This was some number of years ago. But the talk is effectively a love letter to obliquity. It's this idea that a lot of times when we are trying to achieve a goal directly, it's really hard to do. And the only way to achieve, or a better way, and in some cases the only way to achieve a goal in the manner that we might like to, is actually to do so indirectly by various other means. And one of the examples that I sometimes talk to people about is finding a romantic partner. You can get on apps and be like, I want to find a romantic partner. You can swipe and you can think about this with the ultimate goal of like finding this person. And maybe you'll find a person. Maybe that's the fastest route to getting a partner. Are you happy in that relationship? Up in the air, right? Because there's all these things. You need to figure out what it is that you want. You have to figure out what it is that other people want. You have to get good at
Right.
being interesting to somebody else. You have to be good at getting interested in somebody else. And these are
But,
all these sorts of things that we think of as like, well, that's not the same thing as getting a partner. That's
no,
that's
but
that's
they're
not on the
associated
direct path.
skills.
Right, right. It's these skills that are necessary. And I think a lot of times finding at least for me, finding a job has worked the same way. It's not because I applied cold somewhere. It's because I went to a conference and I met someone. We had a good conversation. We ended up doing some work together down the line. Later, they changed jobs. They went to this other place. They remembered that project. When they were looking for somebody, that project reminded them of the new work that needed to be done. Because they had a good experience on that, they called me. We had a conversation about it. And then I ended up working there because I had worked with this person. I didn't go
Right.
to this conference with the intention of eventually getting a job from this person in 7 years. That would have been a real long shot, right? And very indirect. But instead, the way that a lot of my work in my career has come is not by applying directly to something, it has been by planting seeds that come to fruition 5 or 10 years later. Now, understandably, for early career people, this advice is not fun to hear because nobody wants to hear plant seeds now and then in 5 or 10 years something's going to work because they need
Because that's
something now.
yeah, and
Right?
that 5, 10 years perspective is completely unpredictable nowadays, right?
Right,
It's
exactly.
we're moving too fast to be able to predict anything. Maybe 20 years ago we would have been able to predict to a certain degree where we could be potentially in 5 years.
Right.
Nowadays, no chance.
Right. No
But
chance.
you're right on the all the auxiliary skills. It's like to achieve a single goal. Of course you can go towards that goal, but that requires skills that you would probably never think of that you would need to have because
Right.
all of these really matter. And I recently saw a post by Pamela Patterson. You probably met Pamela at DDD Europe at least. Um, Pamela often gives advice and helps people find a job, right?
Hmm.
And I was like, oh, this is actually such a brilliant advice. Is how to get a job, how to find a job, how to actually understand job search. Is that get one tip on finding a job from 100 people.
Hmm.
These 100 people can be whatever experts, influencers, HR, senior business analysts. She mentions because she's a business analyst. Uh, Whoever in the industry you're looking at, because people may be not inclined to help you find a job or refer you or even talk to you. But then if you ask 100 people for a tip on how to find a job, even the most busiest people can spare that few minutes to compose a tip how
Hmm.
to how to do that. Then from that, you already grown your network by 100 people.
Okay.
Then from that, you have a statistically relevant set of tips. You can see which are recurring,
Mm.
which is the thinking of that industry. So
Hmm.
you're already going somewhere, right? And
Hmm.
you're not going to be remembered as somebody who's begging for a job. You're going to be remembered as somebody who's curious
Hmm.
and trying to find their way on their own instead of relying on external help.
Right.
And these are already completely different skill sets in that sense, built around the job search. The end goal is to find a job, but in the meantime, you literally built some social skills. You build some analytical skills to figure out, okay, what is the recurring thing, and you basically networked,
Hmm. That's
right?
true. That's
So
true.
it creates a completely different perspective, and I believe we are not teaching that kind of perspectives anywhere.
I think you're
So
right.
So
I
when
think when we
people go
talk
to
to
the job
students about
market,
networking, usually the thing that students take away from what they've been told about networking is I'm supposed to go to this meetup and talk to people, and one of them is supposed to give me a job in the next 12 months, is like the idea. And maybe it works that way for some people. It has never worked that way for me.
it if you go with that kind of approach, then it will definitely not work that way, right? Because you have to, well, you would have to sell yourself somehow. Not necessarily that you're actually creating a sales pitch and you go from person to person in a networking event and do that kind of selling pitch, but if you have something to offer in a conversation, you're already winning, right? And networking skills, I had to figure it out on my own and late in my career because nobody told me how to do that. Nobody said this is important. I was like, okay, how do I actually approach that?
Right.
No idea. It started by chance and it worked. Okay, so I'm
Right.
just going to follow that. And a lot of people don't know that. So there's a whole set of skills. If I remember university time, we were taught plenty of technical skills,
Hmm.
plenty of physics, maths, electronics, electrical devices, programming. Very little of those were actual curriculums that were soft skills.
Right.
That taught us how to present yourself, how to talk to people. We had language classes. I remember taking English for electrical engineers, which bored me to hell because the teacher even couldn't pronounce half of the words correctly. And then
What
I
is
took,
the difference between regular English and English for electrical engineers? Is it just
yeah,
terminology?
terminology basically.
Got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that was just it.
Okay.
But the person teaching that was a teacher requalified from teaching Russian to teaching English. So obviously, pronunciation was was amazing. I
Sure.
was just sitting there and it was like, oh, what am I doing here? Why am I here? I don't have to do anything to get an A. It's like, what's going on? And of course, going for finding a decent teacher to teach in a specific language in a specific context was, well, a challenge in Poland, but that's a different thing. But barely any of those classes mentioned anything related to how to actually find yourself as a human being in that field.
Sure.
Uh, I believe that is still missing to a large degree. But then, of course, people land somewhere and they start experimenting.
Hmm.
But then now we still have the problem that we have access to information. We don't have that connection to actual knowledge and wisdom gaining from that. And of course, if you apply what you mentioned before, that approach, that mystery novel approach, which I would probably say that kind of feels like cold cycle experiential teaching, right?
Sure.
In my that's the right connotation.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a smarty pants because I'm a trained trainer, so I actually know all these from educational psychology because I took the time to learn it. But
Lovely.
that's well, I dabble. But basically, yeah, you're right. Most of it is like repetition. Very few classes. I don't remember classes at the university that would be that experiential. Put the problem statement. Let's figure it out together.
Hmm.
And then some people racing. Maybe some labs, electrical engineering labs, were like that because we had to like figure it out. We had a script, and then we were sat in front of devices. And it's like, okay, guys, now you figure it out how to make it work.
Hmm.
These were fair. Otherwise, knowledge-based activities, not really.
Hmm.
Programming classes, you have to do it by the book, step by step.
Right.
So we're literally creating people who need an instruction manual, step-by-step manual to proceed.
Right.
Now, how can we move from that kind of a linear thinking? And don't get me wrong, linear thinking in development is actually not that bad because we want that thing to be developed according to specification. Fair.
Right. It can be useful.
It can be useful. But then if we're going to actual engineering, software engineering, that linear thinking becomes more of a burden than something helpful. Right? So how can
There's
we
a time
move
and place
from,
for it for sure, and that time and place is not all the time everywhere.
yeah, Pretty much, depending on what your role you land, what studies you're doing. Some of the studies will require more of that linear thinking. Others will require more of that lateral thinking. Barry O'Reilly is mentioning that all the time in terms of architects. Architects should go and learn to do lateral thinking because that's
Hmm.
required by the job.
Hmm.
Now, how do we teach people to be able to access that lateral thinking? How do we teach people to be able to think critically about the information that they get and start connecting the dots, other
Hmm.
than that experiential uh, approach from Kolb's cycle, where
Right.
it will work because it's designed to work that way,
Hmm.
but you're one teacher that understands Kolb's cycle and will apply Kolb's cycle. The rest may apply that repetition, repetition, repetition pattern. And
Hmm.
how do we teach them to have the skill to think critically instead of rely on the scripts that we prepare as educators?
Right. I think it's a challenging question, but the approach that I've been taking lately is one that derives from some of our understanding of learning styles. And this is probably not going to
Mm-hmm.
go the place where people are expecting it to go, so I'll explain a little bit.
Oh,
But in the early aughts and the 2010s, this idea of learning styles was very popular in pedagogy. And the idea is that, like, some people are visual learners, some people are
yeah.
auditory learners, some people learn by reading or breaking stuff or whatever. And most people have an idea of like what learning styles they like, what learning styles work for them that they prefer. There are a couple of issues with it. The
Mm-hmm.
first is that different people have different learning styles is an interesting idea anecdotally, but not one that can necessarily be applied pedagogically to a classroom full of people with different learning styles. But then,
Right.
second of all, it appears when we actually test folks' retention based on the style in which they have learned something, that evidence doesn't support this hypothesis that some people are like significantly better in certain learning styles and they need things in that specific learning style. However, what the research does seem to consistently demonstrate is that receiving information in multiple different formats through multiple different learning styles causes it to get integrated more reliably than learning it through only one learning style alone. So the
Yeah.
classic example that I like to give people is that a lot of people are under the impression that they are kinesthetic learners, that they learn by getting their hands on things and breaking things and fixing it themselves. And that's fine. I like doing that too. That having been
Yeah.
said, um generally when folks are using that learning style, it is in the context of having already read or watched or heard about something. And so this is already, at a minimum, the second time that they are encountering this information. And what's interesting
Right.
is that when you switch the order, when you tell somebody, figure out how to solve this problem, no information, and then you have them read something about it, the reading, the second time they've encountered the information, is where it clicks. So what we see is that people being
Mm,
able to intake information through multiple different formats helps enormously with attention, with retention, and with application. So how can this be applied? There are a number of different ways this can be applied. One of them is to encourage students, when they get information in one format, to go and find that information in another format. So, for example, I give students interactive text notebooks that allow them to run code and see how it works.
right.
There's explanations in there, there's reading in there, and I will have students, I'll say, go to YouTube, find a video that explains this concept. And I've had students create whole YouTube playlists that are companion playlists to notebooks that I have given them to read
Oh,
or to
cool.
look at. Or students have done, and this one I've had students do, and an LLM can be useful for that for some students. Even more useful, though, is when students have learned something via reading, and then they've opened Claude or something, and they have said, Claude, I'm going to have a conversation with you about this information that I just read. I'm going to explain it in my own words, and I would like you to help me find the places where there are gaps in my understanding, and particularly for the kind of information that was already well supported on the internet by 2022. So it's firmly in the training data for these types of things.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a really useful tool to do that. So, for example, when I'm teaching a statistics class, people's initial statistics class is only covering concepts that have happened between like the 1780s and the 1920s at the latest, right? So this is firmly in the training data. There's nothing new from
Yeah.
2024 that I'm asking these students to apply. So it can be really
True.
helpful in that situation. So that's one way, is to get the information in one format and then find the information in another format. Another way to apply it, and I'm going to need a visual aid for this,
Ooh.
is um is to intake the information in one format and then recreate the information in another format. So I'll give you an example. This is a book.
Mm-hmm.
It's called How Data Happened. Looks like this. It is by Chris Wiggins and Matthew Jones. The subtitle is A History from the Age of Reason to the Age of Algorithms. And I think it is a wonderful book for providing students with historical context about the statistical methods that we learn about in class. It's well written.
Right.
It's relatively, I would call this relatively terse. However, when students are oversubscribed on a graduate workload, as we discussed earlier, and also when they have had less practice being held responsible for the amount of information that's available in a book this size, a book like this can feel overwhelming to students. And this amount of text, like this is purely for a reading-based learning style.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've been working on lately is figuring out how to represent the information in this book in a diagram so that I can use color, size, spatial relationships, and symbols in order to give students an understanding of how that information relates to each other. And the way that I did that was, I've read the book. You can see it's firmly dog-eared, and put names, places, some important information in a table, as well as information about the relationships between those different things. And then I don't think I can share screen, but I might be able to
You
provide
can.
you. I can share screen. Okay.
Yes.
So let me see if I can do that.
I believe the shortcut is H.
H.
Simply
H is the
pressing
shortcut.
H.
I'm gonna figure this out. H. Oh.
No, you can share screen. That's perfectly fine.
Uh.
As far as I remember from educational psychology, what I learned that these learning styles you mentioned, as in by doing, by listening, by seeing, they were actually disproven scientifically that this is not a thing. But I absolutely agree that to make it more tangible for learners, you need to apply all three of them, because that variety makes the brain work differently. Especially if you're neuroatypical, that works magic. Right? So to give you an example, because my lovely neuroatypical autistic the ADHD brain, before I got diagnosed, at a certain time in my life, it made me stop reading books. I used to be a bookworm. I used to love reading books. I used to do novels. I used to read technical books, just devour them. At a certain point in my life, my brain stopped working that way, so I cannot consume books. Now that
Okay.
I'm medicated for ADHD, I can now consume books at a slower pace than I used to, but now it's doable. So having a completely different format to the contents of that book actually helps me properly digest. So what I observe also with how my wife is learning, she is transferring always all information that she's learning either from video or from reading into mind maps. She's making them, applying them in a 2D space and creating connections between them just to make notes that way. And mind maps, she's like really making humongous mind maps just to comprehend that information, because that's a different format representing the same information.
Right.
And same for other people. They have their own ways of representing those by taking notes, doing scribbles, or some people have the brain works in a mysterious way. So association for music. People are reading things and having music on, and then they associate that information with specific tones. And they do that entirely subconsciously, but because there is this association in the brain of two different signals coming in, well, we now have retention for some reason.
Right. Do you know
and
that
that
it's
variety is
funny that
there.
you mention this because I remember in grade school, I used to be a big doodler. And this was,
Oh yeah.
in grade school, kids don't know how to take notes yet. So I wasn't really taking notes. I was doodling. And teachers would get on to me. Why are you doodling? You're not paying attention in class and blah, 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 blah. A thing that I did not understand how to explain to teachers at the time was that if I was drawing while they were explaining something, I could look at the drawing and have better attention as to what it was that they were saying.
Yeah, also for people with ADHD, that kind of doodling is their method of focusing the brain. Like it's basically stimming. It's
Oh,
stimul.
interesting.
Yeah, doodling, tapping, playing with a fidget spinner, anything like that. That basically is a stimulation method, so that a person with ADHD can retain focus on something. Otherwise, they'll start doing something else because the focus is gone. And for that matter, I have these kind of small spinners on my
Oh,
desk
what
all the
is
time.
that?
That's literally a bearing with a
Okay.
rubber on it. It's a plastic bearing. It's like a fidget spinner, only minimized to fit on the finger and to be able to play with that.
Okay.
And what a lot of educators now realize that because the diagnostic criteria for all sorts of spectrum disorders, mm, uh, they basically changed over the years because more studies were conducted. So now we recognize that people are actually, uh, you know, doing this for a reason. Right.
Hmm.
You say you for some reason you cannot share. That's not a problem. I'll just open it up on my screen. Give. Oh, yeah. Now I need to just save it.
Yeah. So this book, How Data Happens, I wanted to figure out a way to
Yeah.
visually represent some of the important pieces of information that were in here. And I wanted to do it over
Mm-hmm.
time because what this does is each chapter follows a specific theme of
Mm-hmm.
the development of statistical learning. And they jump around in time a little bit, but they sort of do go, and you'll be able to see this in the diagram from earlier to later. So, chapter 2,
There
yeah,
we
here we
go.
go. So what you're looking at here is there are 13 chapters in the book. The first chapter is a little more holistic, so it's not represented in this diagram.
Mm-hmm.
But from the top all the way around clockwise are the
Mm-hmm.
chapters of the book from chapter 2 through chapter 13. And it's a tree
Right.
ring diagram, which means that the earliest dates are at the center. And as you go outward, you get later dates in the same way that the rings of a tree accumulate as the tree grows over time. You see this outward spiral that represents the
Mm-hmm.
fact that the earlier chapters tend to focus on events that happened earlier in time, and the later chapters tend to focus on events that happen later in time. But each of the dot colors represents a different type of event, whether it has to do with people power, state power, corporate power. And the
Right.
lines that you see between them represent the ways that they influenced each other. For example, one paper might have prompted the work of that ended up being another paper, or one paper might have been rebutting another paper, or the publication of a specific book resulted in these three experiments happening, or what have you. And so my
Right.
hope is to be able to represent with these sort of spatial relationships and these colors what has happened in a way that gives students an ability to geographically anchor the events that I'm asking them to learn about. However, what I have learned through, or what I've discovered, which isn't terribly surprising, is that through the process of creating this diagram, I have learned the information a lot better myself, which is giving me ideas about how to help students with retention in the future, related to, for example, having them read passages and then find ways to visually represent them like this. Because looking at the visual representation in addition to the text is helpful, but creating the visual representation from the text is really transformative for being able to understand and apply the knowledge.
Yeah, that is that aspect of different kinds of representation that it brings. Like, yeah, so you're taking notes, and the notes can be, for example, rich in diagrams, etc., or you re-recording that, for example, or you're making it a graphical aid.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen also people do that, totally not knowing that it works in a psychological aspect. They just did that for themselves, and some even named those as methods and started telling other people to do this and this because it works. It
Mhm.
works for them. It doesn't necessarily work for other people, but if you try enough methods, then you'll be able to find the method that works for you.
Right.
And yeah, some people are more inclined to that visual way of thinking, and visuals really help them dig through this. Myself, when I'm preparing for classes to teach, or well, preparing the material, because preparing for classes is easier than preparing the actual content. It's like, okay, I have this content, I need to explain it, all right, and then I start digging into it, and oh, I need to draft it in diagrams because I need to understand it better, because this part I actually don't understand about the content, and I need to learn it myself to be able to teach it properly. So it's
Mhm.
like all the research that goes into content creation or class creation, that actually requires to like that pondering. That pondering in the corporate world is something that really doesn't happen
Mhm.
because we don't have that time, because we have a deadline. And
Right.
that's where those other skills, those auxiliary skills, come in, that we need to get them in, so we have that time boxing, time management, to figure it out, to outline that, to have time in the day to do these things, on top of socializing with our colleagues at work, on top of doing actual work, on top of having our brain some time to relax.
Mhm.
Because that's another problem, at least work related. I don't know if that's university related, but and this is noticed by people doing team topologies and cognitive load studies, uh, that we were promised that AI will take away the hard parts of the job. It took away the easy parts of the job, and we were supposed to work less, but we don't work less. We still work 8 hours, most of us
Right.
at least, right? And what AI did, it took the easy parts out because we somewhat automated them, or we just delegated them to whatever chatbot we're using. All
Mhm.
perfectly fine. But now that means that our brains are burdened with the heavy parts of the job for more than 2 hours a day, where we would be like, well, maybe 2 hours a day we'll work on the heavy parts. The other 6 hours will be working on the easier parts. Or
Mhm.
maybe, well, let's say 4 hours, and two of them will be like going to meetings, socializing with colleagues, whatever we do at work, right? Because
Mhm.
nobody works 8 hours. That's a ridiculous notion. We are at work 8 hours, but we don't work 8 hours. That's that how it happens. But now, because of AI, we're literally working on the harder parts for a longer time period in work,
Mhm.
which causes a lot of burnout, cognitive load. So because we're using our brains a lot more, so we're not processing. We're basically, little walking zombies after work, because we had to digest so much information.
Mhm.
And I believe that coming from university, people are definitely not prepared for that kind of thing. Most companies do not realize that that cognitive load actually exists. Furthermore, some people are still illusioned about the capabilities of AI and how much it can automate the hard parts.
Mhm.
And the hard parts will not be automated because they require that human touch and context, which AI is not going to be able to do, and also hopefully for a long time. Uh, and then, it's like, okay, what are the skills that we need right now to be able to actually survive? Because a lot of my colleagues, or other people my age that I see working in the industry, they're like slowly burning out, and slowly and not visibly. It's not because of stress, it's not because of the organizational pressure, it's because they shifted the scope of work they're doing to work that requires substantially more thinking and more
Mhm.
brain power than before, because they had those easy tasks. Now they automated all the easy tasks, and now, oh, okay, right, now the hard parts remain.
Right. It's certainly the case that the brain has a limit on the amount of heavy analytical work that it's capable of doing in a particular time period. And I think it's also the case that burnout uh burnout and feelings that drive towards burnout come as well from the sense of working really hard without a clear vision of the purpose behind that work. How is this going to benefit someone? What is the goal
Yeah.
here? There's this missing piece, I think, that sometimes happens. And I think I see it happen to developers, and this is, kind of later in your career, but you get to like 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years. And more of the things that you built become shelfware. A lot of the things you build become shelfware before they hit production. I think that happens to folks. And there comes this point where sometimes the amount of work that they're doing, like now they're being asked to do more, they're being asked to ship and produce faster. And I think
Mm-hmm.
there's this thought process of like, the speed that I shipped before still didn't result in anything getting to production. So can we figure out how to fix whatever it is that's causing us to spend enormous cycles on all of this stuff that doesn't end up matching what our consumers want, that ends up not being the direction the company goes, what have you. There's this purpose piece that I think isn't always necessarily guaranteed, that I think folks are struggling with. And I think a lot of that comes from tech broadly not really knowing what to do with itself sometimes. And I think this is part of where this, like, you mentioned earlier that like companies say they're doing these layoffs because of AI. And I think like part of this is absolutely, once it is quicker to create code, companies want to experiment with whether it is possible to reduce their costs in the code creation department. I believe that that is a part of it. And I believe that also a non-negligibly large part of it is, if you look at the history of tech has always had these kind of layoff flus that happen. And in particular, in areas of significant economic turmoil, there tends to be these sort of like layoff flus. But tech has had a fair amount of churn for forever. But what feels more palatable to an executive team? We need to admit that we're now performing this layoff because for the past 10 years, we've been completely unaligned on the strategic vision for this company. Or, whoops, AI transformation. Like, which of these is less of an indictment of the skill of the executive suite? I think points a lot to the degree to which layoffs are blamed on AI today.
Yeah, that's true. Alex has shared an interesting statistic. So there are some AI fatigue statistics. So we have 65% of software engineers report that AI tool integration has increased their daily stress instead of reducing it. 52%, so more than half, say reviewing AI-generated code is more mentally tiring than writing equivalent code themselves. I mean, fair. And speed to commit improved, but mental cost per commit went drastically up. And then 29%, so nearly 1 in 3, has considered leaving their role because of pressure related to AI tool adoption, pace, expectation, or feeling unable to keep up. And this is not a niche problem. This is a workforce level signal. And we're seeing that all over the place. I mean, the amount of times I've heard that you need to use AI. You need to it's like AI tools being shoved through the throat to every single employee. It doesn't even matter if it makes sense. They need to be AI literate and they need to do AI in their daily work. And I'm like, why? Because if I try to do my work using AI, I get just a stack of hallucination. Because as an integration architect, there is no source that all those companies could have consumed to actually deliver something that is meaningful in terms of my field of work, because there are no sources. The sources are paywalled with technology vendors. And that's fantastic, because every time I try to prompt about any term related, I get historical data. Fair.
Right.
But anything modern,
Yeah.
pure hallucination. Basically, every time I ask about integration architecture, the conversation with an LLM is dumped down to REST endpoints.
Yeah, I suspect that your role experiences this sort of like on the top end of the extent to which it's experienced, because you're so frequently working with integrations that necessarily require APIs that change relatively frequently. And because these models are trained relatively infrequently, the bulk of the training data doesn't support the current shape of the API to the extent that it's even available online, which is largely probably through Stack Overflow or something like that.
But to that sense, the field of integration architecture is APIs is 1% of the field, like literally. The rest of this is message brokers, understanding how they work, how event-driven works, how integration brokers work, how enterprise service bus works, how it is named nowadays, because nobody is using the term ESB because
Mm,
of the good old SOA days where the term was completely burned. So now it's the term iPass. If you don't know what you're asking about, it will give you different answers. If you ask about an iPass, it will give you a different answer than if you ask about an ESB. And in the training data, there is no connection between one another because
right,
nobody wants to make that connection because of the stigma of ESBs,
right,
etc., etc., etc. So in that sense, you have to have, as a specialist, already a sense of critical thinking to be able to connect the dots, connect that information in context, create knowledge and wisdom out of it. And this took me 15 years to gather all that knowledge to be able to create wisdom out of it. Now,
hmm,
if we're replacing juniors to a certain extent with AI because we can speed up our developers and senior developers with AI, so we're not hiring that much. How are those people are supposed to learn the trade? Because a lot of the learning we do is for professional roles in IT is completely outside of university.
right, yeah,
So how, looking from an educator's perspective, if a company decides to hire a junior, how should they go and approach preparing them for that role that they are supposed to have as a mid senior developer?
right. It's
Because
an excellent question.
developers is not exactly as much reliable. There are great senior developers that will share knowledge. There are those that are going to silo themselves and not share knowledge at all. So that's a lottery,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, there are some skills that I think are really important for junior developers to develop when they get into the workforce. And interestingly, I actually think that a lot of these tools, or rather skills, are skills that already new graduates were underskilled in relative to what they're going to need for the workforce prior to the advent of like AI tools or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that the trend in how much they're needed has become more pronounced rather than reverse direction. So, for example, in university programs, as well as tutorials, as well as books, as well as most of the information on the internet, when we are teaching people to program, we focus on how to build something from scratch. In this file, add a function that does whatever, build an app that does this thing in this framework, whatever. And uh that skill set is where their education is primarily focused. But then they get into the job and usually they need to collaboratively maintain something that they did not write. So they
Mm-hmm.
end up needing to build these skills in reading and analyzing code. They need to build skills in investigating how something works in a code base and why. They need to build skills in debugging, figuring out how to challenge their assumptions so that they can figure out what is happening that is causing this thing to produce behavior that is different from the expectations. These are
Mm-hmm.
things we don't spend an enormous amount of time on in educational institutions, and the students do not arrive in the workforce with a systematic understanding of how to do, nor do they
Mm-hmm.
get a systematic understanding of how to do them ever. They just sort of have to build one from scratch based on their experiences with, for example, individual bugs or individual changes. I think to the
Right.
extent that we are able to coach them in a systematic understanding of how to debug, or of how to investigate a code base, how to investigate a question in a code base, how to analyze a code base. Those things could be really useful for them. So I think that's kind of the first thing. The second thing that I think is valuable for folks who are just entering the workforce, coming from like a graduate or undergraduate education, are going to need are some of those work skills that you and I were talking about earlier. I do think that reading comprehension is one of them. I think that's a really important thing for them to have, particularly if they want to go into like machine learning engineering or something like that, because in a field like that, you're reading a number of papers every week, and asking for an AI
Right.
summary of them is not going to help you to apply that information in the places where you need it. It just isn't. It just isn't. But then
Especially
there's
that the
also time
complex,
management. What'd you say?
especially that the complexity of the field of machine learning is very high compared to functional programming of a domain system, right?
Right.
It's
Sometimes
a
the
completely
reason the
different level.
paper is 80 pages is that you cannot explain all of the results of the paper in 3/4 of a page. Sometimes you just
Yeah.
have to, there's too much information. That's absolutely the case. But
Yeah.
I think also folks come in and need an understanding of some of the skills we talked about earlier, the time management skills, the task management skills. There are these pieces of, you were working on small projects where somebody told you what was due on Wednesday. Now we're telling you we're getting fired from this client if we don't have blah delivered by September. It's currently January. What are you going to do in the immediate term? And theoretically, we can rely some on product managers, project managers, more senior engineers to help with driving this. But that's absolutely a skill set that new entrants are going to need to be able to develop, not only to be able to do the jobs they have right now, but also to career plan. Because we're seeing that in sort of the current environment, having done some career planning and being able to execute a flexible career plan can be useful, but also is like kind of necessary. With the industry changing as quickly as it is, flexibility is valuable. Optionality is valuable. This idea from Kent Beck of being able to change strategies relatively quickly. He applies it in particular in like software architecture, but I think it's also applicable to career planning as well. Given two paths that are equal in all of the other ways, one that presents more options for directions you can go is the more valuable one. And that's a skill set we more or less, not only do we not teach it in like a university environment, we sort of how would I put this? We sort of
Discourage it.
like suggest it's not a thing. We move people away from that and towards doing the precise pipeline that we've given them. You know what I mean?
So again, manufacturing.
Well, right. There's this sort of pipeline mindset that I think is derelict where we can be derelict in our duty as educators to give students the practice necessary for doing that lateral thinking that you were talking about.
One thing that I noticed with a colleague of mine who's actually built his own LMS to teach integration with MuleSoft, because he's a MuleSoft specialist, and he decided at a certain point that, okay, I'm doing work as a consultant, but I actually want to teach people.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that he's very proud of is to actually present problems that are not typical textbook problems. So if you go on a let's say MuleSoft course, some of them are for free. You can just go to Salesforce Trailblazers and do them. You have a curriculum that guides you pretty much linearly, step by step, through certain aspects of development. Potentially from that, with some experimentation, you can learn enough to pass the developer certification. Now, the problem is that examples given there are usually extremely simplistic.
Mm.
So that you don't really learn what is expected on the job as an integration developer developing in MuleSoft. You
Mm-hmm.
actually then on the job you're surprised, oh, that wasn't covered anywhere. Okay, how do I fix this even? How do I do this even? How do I yeah at this side I have XML, and this side I have JSON. This side here has some really crazy data structures, and
Right.
the attributes are formatted in a weird way. Like let's say old school Salesforce would use to return an address in address lines, not in street, city, street number, house number, etc. But like address line, you need to parse that. Hey,
Mm-hmm.
nobody told me how to design a mapping to actually parse that and actually dismantle that into a street, a house number, flat number, postcode, county, country. It's like, oh, how do I even approach that? So he's
Mm-hmm.
like started like thinking, okay, we need to start designing exercises that put us in an actual problem space of those messy data structures, because obviously not everything in IT is designed properly. Some things are just built.
Right.
They have implicit architecture, and also data structures are then implicit rather than designed, and you have to deal with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he started thinking, okay, we need to start building exercises that are actually exactly these kind of problem spaces, that are work-related problem spaces, something that you might actually experience on the job rather than something that somebody figured that academically would be sound to know.
Right.
But that sound to know means to get you started, not to get you expertise in that
Right.
sense. It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of that way at the moment. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so building these kind of things are extremely hard, because now if I sit as an expert, and let's say 15 years of professional experience constitutes me being an expert in integration, for me, I'm already biased because I already have the so-called curse of knowledge bias. Because certain things for me are extremely easy because I've done them so many times. I don't know which of those things are actually problematic for a junior developer or a meteor developer.
Right.
For me, they're obvious.
Right.
So how do I judge as a content creator, as somebody creating a course, a class? How can I figure out, which parts are actually the parts that I should be teaching instead of what I think should be taught?
Right. Well,
Uh,
and it turns out that students who are new to a concept don't respond particularly well to the teacher saying, "I don't understand why this is so hard." Because even when you think you're expressing a limitation to a student, this sounds like, you bonehead. How do you not get this already?
yeah, but they're not boneheaded. They just lack your experience in the field to
No,
be able to
right,
comprehend
exactly.
that.
You have lost the ability to bridge this gap to somebody who is new to this thing.
Exactly, and that poses another problem. How do we move from that classical education where we have theoretical, isolated cases that
Hmm.
are in this kind of idealistic environment? Like people are taught physics. When they're taught physics, they're taught physics in idealistic environment. No
Right. You assume a
friction.
spherical
No,
cow and things like that.
kinda, yes. Or that an object is moving and there's no friction.
Right.
Yeah, outer space, not on the road, definitely. Here we go. Right. So reality has a lot more variables. Of course, to teach a concept, it's easier to remove certain variables just to showcase that concept. But the real work of that, well, I don't know many physicists that actually work as physicists. That's another problem. But in programming, okay, we can showcase that concept of a specific, I don't know, algorithm or something, sorting algorithm, whatever that may be. But how do we apply that in the real world? Where is it applicable? What are the problems with applying that in the real world?
Mm-hmm.
These concepts are constantly missing.
Mm-hmm.
Same with teaching architecture, as I see it. A lot of people don't even differentiate architecture from solutioning, where
Mm.
solutioning is the process of designing something in a set architecture against something that we already have established as structure, and now we're just adding function to it. Well,
Right.
fantastic. They call this architecture, but that's actually solutioning. That's actually design.
Right.
And it's like, how do we teach this comprehension of things in this messy, multivariable environment where we're normally teaching in an isolated environment that doesn't have those variables? And those variables do not mess up our lovely examples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because at work, it's going to be messy.
Right. It is. Right. And it can feel really challenging to address that when you are coming in with training that has been entirely pristine. You've never encountered a challenge like this where all of these three things, as you were saying, we learned how to deal with inertia in the absence of friction. And then maybe we learned about friction. And maybe we also then learned about this other thing. I don't know, this third thing, but I have never put all three of them together into the same problem. And now every problem that I work on is going to have all three because I got this physics education, but now I work as an engineer on Earth where there's always gravity and there's always friction and there's always mass and there is always, I'm outside, so there's always wind that I need to worry about. There's always all
Yeah,
of these other concerned temperature things are going to expand, contract. I learned about each of these things in isolation, and now I have to apply a minimum of 7 of them for the simplest possible problem.
exactly. And account for them. Otherwise, something will break because we're in mechanical engineering, and these are all factors that will change the behavior of the machine and
Right,
make it a very costly repair afterwards if we don't account for that, right? Uh,
right.
Same with software, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're okay. You learn how to design an API. Okay, but you learned it in an isolated environment with principles like, oh, you need an open API spec. That open API spec needs to have HTTP verbs, a proper URI that is resource related. And then you get hit in reality that you need to connect to an API that is pure crud,
Right,
poorly composed, with poorly defined structures, with hidden pathological coupling that you actually need to understand how the system works to actually be able to go into connecting to that API and using it.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly you have to acknowledge that there are so many other factors, like, all fields are optional, all fields are string. And suddenly you send that string is suddenly enumerated, and you didn't know that because in the specification there's no enumeration. What
Mm-hmm.
then? Etc.
Mm-hmm.
etc. And then you go into debugging and trying to find out what the hell went wrong. And those skills are not there because nobody taught you to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes, there is this combinatorial aspect to the skills that we teach people largely in isolation that makes it very challenging, I think, to apply them as a group. And we treat, I mean, I think it's the same thing with analyzing and debugging code. We tend to treat as the exception in the educational process things that end up becoming the rule when you're working in a professional environment.
And Alex, I absolutely love your quotes from philosophy and other aspects of anything working in IT. I mean, you have this amazing library of quotes here, and every every complex problem there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. Absolutely agree.
Yep.
But we're trying to find an answer for a complex problem that is not simple, and
Mm-hmm.
it's at least somewhat correct. Maybe not clear enough because it's not going to be clear always, right?
Right. Yeah.
So going to the aspect of advice for students, advice for managers, managing teams of devs, hiring those juniors. How do
Mm-hmm.
we proceed from here? We know that education is pristine, fantastic. Now we have a messy thing called work. We have people that are lacking skills, lacking at times comprehension of the field they're joining in the workforce. How do we educate them? How do we move on from that, whatever that is, the degree, the bachelor's, master's degree, into creating somebody who can actually, navigate the workplace and navigate the problem space that we're working?
Right. Well, this particular piece won't necessarily be useful for managers, but I do place some of the responsibility for the preparation there onto us at the university level. I think there is, as sort of like in curricular education, my hope is that there is more that we could be doing to prepare students for that reality. It's made somewhat challenging by sort of the commodification of graduate degrees in a way that causes folks to select the coursework that they take based on the specific skills that they need to be able to represent on a resume, with time management and things like that not necessarily being one of them, and debugging
Right.
not really feeling like it's going to be another. But I think even if they wanted to select those sorts of skills for their professional preparation right now, those things are not offered in the coursework to the degree that we probably could and should offer them, and certainly not marketed to the degree that it would make sense for us to market them, even if we are trying to provide them. So I think that there is a piece of that, but presumably most folks who are encountering this problem are not themselves university instructors. They are instead early career developers themselves, or they are managers attempting to help coach and mentor early career developers. I think
Right.
that in those circumstances, certainly as a manager, I think a thing that is valuable to the extent that you can do it is to give new developers deliberate practice in precisely some of these skills that we've been talking about, in which they're going to be underskilled when they're coming in. Many of them are, of course, things that the advent of AI did not make people more underskilled at. They are things that folks have always been underskilled at coming in from a university education. And so I suspect that those are things that in a lot of ways managers are going to be used to. I think the people for whom the absence of some of these skills is going to be news is going to be a lot of the early career professionals themselves. And I think that the reason for that is that we have failed to communicate to them some of the expectations that we are going to have at the professional level. I think it would be a
Mm.
surprise to my students if I were to tell them, for example, my baseline expectation in this class is that you read 250 words per minute when I assign you a book. I think that would be news. I don't think that that would be a thing that had been communicated with them before, which is
Right.
not, again, an indictment of them. I think it's an expectation that we were, it must be said, much better at setting when undergraduate institutions were not all unitarily thrust into this deeply traumatic high change event for 5 or 6 years, whatever, you know? And I
Right.
think that these making those expectations clear is, again, a thing that we should be doing. But I think it's helpful for early career professionals to know about these things, to understand this is what my reading volume is going to be if I want to stay current in the field that I'm going to be in. This is what it's going to take for me to keep up with that reading volume. This is the size of projects that I'm likely to be assigned when I am in my sort of early career. This is the type of project planning that I need to be used to in order to be able to do that. Or this is the type of system I'm going to be working in. Sometimes things go wrong. Let me practice how to investigate issues in that system such that I might have the ability to do that when I'm asked to do it on the job. I think that
Hmm.
that sort of like list of necessary and underrepresented skills is missing for a lot of these folks. And even having that list would be useful to them in putting together a practice plan.
Then the question is, how do we actually compose that list?
Mm. It's a good question. I mean, you and I have talked about some of what our additions to that list might be.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder to what extent that list varies depending on the organization that they're applying to. And so I wonder whether there is value for early career professionals in asking questions early in the interview process. A lot of times we make fun of this question that interviewers will ask, do you have any questions for me? Because interviewers do not do a very good job of communicating or executing on the idea that that portion of the interview should not be evaluated. It's not like an evaluative piece of it, or at least it shouldn't be. A thing that I say when I'm interviewing candidates is at 55 minutes or whatever after I've done my evaluation, I'll tell them the evaluative portion of the interview is ended. Now, if you have questions for me, this part doesn't go into the grading or whatever. I want to hear your genuine questions. And that can be really useful for folks, particularly at the late career stages, because they're going to have questions about whatever the projects they're going to get to work on and that kind of thing. But I think at the
Yeah.
early career level as well, it is possible, maybe even before going in for the interview, to, in the information gathering step, ask what skills are going to be important for me to develop in order for me to be able to do this job. I remember very clearly that when I first started applying to programmer jobs, I came out of an immersion program and I was applying to Pivotal Labs, which is a consultancy that asks people to very quickly ramp on programming languages for the purpose of being able to serve a lot of times enterprise clients. They were asking for a much higher level of experience than I had. I interviewed anyway because I think I maybe didn't entirely understand that, or it was a long time ago. I forget exactly what happened. But on the initial interview, I did not pass by senior software engineer standards, but I got a high score by entry level very high score by entry level standards. And so I had a
Okay.
conversation with the hiring manager where he was like, listen, for the job opening I posted, you just do not have enough experience to be able to do it. However, if you were to want to be able to grow into doing this job, these are the 5 books that I need you to read. I'm going to pass you into the second round of interviews. And for the love of God, please have read these 5 books by the time you come in for that second round. And it was like Extreme Programming Explained. It was a test driven development book. Kent Beck was heavily represented in the books. Martin Fowler was heavily represented in the
Right.
book. I believe Sandy Metz was also among the books. Um, and had me read those books because he wanted to communicate very clearly, these are skills I'm going to expect you to be able to apply in this role. You don't have them, and I have some
You need to
amount of
get them.
patience, but I need you to demonstrate to me that you can get them in short order. Yeah, exactly.
I think that one thing that is in most recruitment processes missing a lot of the times is the actual knowledge that the hiring manager would need to have about what actual skills he needs.
Right.
I've been in so many processes where those managers had absolutely zero idea.
Right.
I was on the other side of the recruitment process as one interviewing, and those next to me or in the next stages had no idea what were the
Mm-hmm.
skills required. I
Mm-hmm.
may have had an idea of the skills required, especially technical skills, but the hiring manager, who was more of a politician than a techie, definitely no idea over those skills. So you were lacking in that regards because that was actually somebody who actually knew what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. I got very lucky.
A large number of managers would probably not be able to tell you you need to read this, this, and this
Right.
because they have no idea because they're managers, not actual engineers.
Right.
Unless you actually have an interview with actual engineers that do the job, then of course that may be something, depending if they're actually able to say what the sources are, because that's
Right.
not always also the truth, because they learn on the job, they learn from the internet, they learn from Stack Overflow, and suddenly the sources of knowledge are completely distributed and obscured,
Right. Well, and I
right?
think that this is an important part of the value of the informational interview as well. You're right. The hiring manager is often not going to know what skills are necessary, but when, as I said, it's been a moment since I applied for an engineering job. But when I was applying heavily, the thing that I would often do is identify roles that I thought would make sense for me, or identify teams that I thought would make sense for me, regardless of whether a role was posted at a given time, and reach out to engineers who were on that team to ask for information about the role, to ask for information about the team, find out what they were doing, and basically to ask questions. And
Right.
it is through that I was able to get a lot of information about the skills that I would need in other roles, because the hiring manager might not know what skills are necessary, but the engineers who are going to be working with you, oh man, would they just love for one of the candidates to be like, what do I need to be good at to make your life easier? Because a lot
They
of
would
times
love
what's
that.
happening, especially if a role is being backfilled, they know exactly what was missing, right?
Yeah,
So
that's
I
true.
think I think that that has been really useful to me, is to talk to other practitioners on the team. And it's not just, I'm not just trying to develop relationships with other people on the team because then they'll put in a good word for me or whatever. I'm actually asking questions where the answers are actually important to me, because suppose I go for an informational interview, and suppose that this potential future colleague of mine is like, you're going to need the skills represented in these 3 books. Fine. I look at the books, and as I'm reading the books, I just cannot keep my eyes open. It is so boring, the information that's in these books. I don't like it. I don't see myself applying this information. That is valuable to me, because what that tells me is I'm going to hate it here, you know? And I should invest in this job interview process accordingly to the fact that I would hate it here, you know?
Right.
As opposed to
Yeah.
getting in there and I'm grateful for the salary for like 4 months, and then I hate it
Uh,
here. Do I want to do that, particularly early in the career? That can be challenging, because particularly early in the career, people understand, well, I got to stay a year or two or else I'm going to look like a job hopper, but I hate it here. So if you can avoid that situation, better, right? Than not
right.
avoiding the situation, I would say.
So on that side, for anybody joining the workforce, would be ask questions, but ask questions to the right people who might actually know the answers and be curious about that. On the other side, for anybody hiring, come prepared and actually ask your team what are the skills that you need to compose, first of all, the posting better, second of all, to be prepared for the interview, to actually tell the candidate what skills you actually require on the job, rather than
Mm.
rely on whatever HR recruitment whips up in the job posting, because that's at times when I read job postings, that's like, oh, how much bullshit there is in those. Uh,
Right.
that's a different story entirely. Um, what I saw some time ago, I believe that was somewhere around February this year. There was this Socrates unconference online organized. Someone by Mike Clement, I believe, in the US.
Okay.
Uh, there was a bunch of students invited to the conference, so they joined. They actually attended several sessions. They even organized sessions, because unconference, obviously, so they organized even a session of their own, where they invited from the gathering, they invited specialists like, come talk to us, tell us what you find relevant for us to learn to be effective in the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
What you see now as the skills that you, for example, if you knew 15 years ago, you would find that, oh, I really need to learn that, because that would make my life so much easier now, because I learned that. Otherwise, I had to learn in the pain of going through the chore of making errors all the time.
Right.
And that's another aspect, that just to reach out to people, to like I mentioned, the tip thing, reach out to 100 people to get a tip on how to get a job or how to get an interview. Same thing for a specific role. If you reach out to people and ask them for one tip how to be efficient at that role, that's going to be of statistical relevance. The same with those students. They asked us what, from the perspective of what you know now, would be the skill you wanted to know and learn as a junior,
Mm-hmm.
so that would make your life a lot easier. Most of the answers, seriously, were about soft skills, communication skills,
Mm-hmm.
understanding context, being able to present, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Crazy on that, how we were as professionals completely not prepared for the tasks that we actually had to do, and we had
Mm-hmm.
to learn them, to learn to present, to convey meaning, to convey a message, to actually convince people that this is the right idea, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
etc. Right? So still, we're not preparing people for the soft skills, we're preparing them technically, and
Mm-hmm.
not even great at that at this point, to certain degrees, right? So that was another, at least from my perspective, another way of doing it for young
Mm-hmm.
professionals at least.
Mm-hmm. Do you find so? Did Socrates have a lot of young professionals at it?
That particular session, I would say that like maybe 10% of the audience,
Okay. I'm curious
maybe a
if they
little bit
mentioned
less.
at all what specific skills they wished they had or wanted to build. Or was it just sort of communication in general, or were they saying
No,
whatever?
no, they were like with examples, with specific situations, etc. They were really explaining why that skill mattered
Mm.
with their work experience. So that session was like, several senior people sitting in that session and just going about, I wish I learned this and this and this because of this and this and this, and that would help this and this way, etc. So that was
Right,
like with a proper justification. So that very important why was there, not just you need to learn this, but
right,
actually why you need to learn this, which
right,
creates the better drive for learning, at least
right,
in my understanding.
right. I'm reminded of an anecdote from a university, not the University of Chicago, where a student applied for a number of jobs and was going through the interview process with several of them and then got a job. Uh, and they were very happy and they got their job offer. But they, in the process, dropped communication with the other three places that they were late in the interview process for, were ghosting interviews and things like that. And when the when this was addressed with them, it turned out that that when they were asked, "Do you understand what closing the loop is?" This was not a phrase that they had heard before. Nobody had explained to them that
Mm-hmm.
when you are in these processes, you are expected, like if you are pretty far in the process, it is polite to let people know if you're going with another offer or whatever, just so that they're not expending resources. And the student explained, like, well, companies would ghost me if they weren't interested in me anymore. And it's like, yeah, that maybe not, but this isn't really about what companies would do or whatever. This is about sort of like maintaining your own communication standards, because your communication standards aren't ultimately about like, well, one company whatever mistreated me and sure they shouldn't have done that, but regardless of what companies do, your standard of communication matters over time. And sure, like, it doesn't mean that every communication interaction you ever have is going to go swimmingly for you, but what it means is if you can maintain those skills, then the pattern of success that you're going to have over time is going to produce a much more positive trajectory than the other one. And I felt
Right.
so uh a little bit angry on behalf of this student that they had managed to make it so far in their education without anyone explaining to them what a concrete like effectuation of communication skill would look like. They'd been told it's important to be good at communication, but no one had said that means follow up. That means if somebody emails you and you can't get to it for 2 weeks, email them and tell them that you're going to get to it in 2 weeks. That means like reach out to people, whatever, via these certain formats or during business hours. Don't like whatever, text people at 2 a.m. about work stuff. Like these sorts of specific concrete do's and don'ts and how it's going to impact people.
Yeah.
We tell people be good at communication, but we don't necessarily, unless
What
people
does
specifically
that
seek out the
mean?
information on their own, we don't coach them all the time.
Yeah, that's very true. I guess this you could kind of narrow it down. Treat others how you would want to be treated. To that example that you gave, but basically you're absolutely right. We tell that people get better at communicating, but what the hell does that mean? That
Right.
is abstract. There's nothing concrete to grab onto in that.
Right.
It's like, it kind of reminds me the memes over playing Dark Souls. I don't know if you're familiar with the game. It's an extremely difficult RPG, right?
Hmm.
And the common advice from the memes is get good. What
Right.
does that mean, right? It's like, yeah, get good at something, but how, when, what, where to begin, even? And it's like,
Yeah.
literally, if I go and try to learn a new technology and I open a repo on GitHub, I don't even know where to begin, right?
Right.
How do I
Yeah.
get good at this? Where the repo is so that I like, what am I supposed to, read all the code and try to understand it? How do I even begin? With a lot of things, it's like that. We don't know where to begin. We need some guidance to be able to begin.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So in that sense, yeah, okay. So who's going to give that guidance? Because university-wise, pristine, yeah, that will work to the degree to get a
Right.
good degree. Uh, Management-wise, in companies, young professional programs, is that enough guidance there to actually build that professional, or is it just going to be random? Or should that young professional take the reins by themselves and just try to figure out from whom to find guidance?
Right. It's a good question. I'm trying to remember. At this point, this was a very long time ago, but I remember particularly early in late in my undergraduate career and then early in my professional career, I found myself looking to outside resources for this. I hadn't necessarily learned it all in undergraduate. I was fortunate that in my particular undergraduate program, there were some resources for learning professional skills, things like we did this, I don't know, strategic dining seminar that talked about like how do you have a business meeting where there's eating involved and stuff like that. And so those were things. It wouldn't have ever occurred to me that that was a skill without
Right.
that. Absolutely not. Um, but when it came to things like, looking for a job early on, when it came to even like money management, how do I save money? What am I supposed to do with it? What is an appropriate financial cushion? How do I go about all those kinds of things? For all of those things, I did find myself looking to outside resources because the university did not necessarily provide them. My parents had grown up in a very different economic environment than the one that I was living in, and so their advice wasn't necessarily as applicable under these circumstances. And it was very much I had to I had to vet for myself what the appropriate resources were. And for me at the time, it was a lot of like library books. It was, the online courses. I sort of like the internet, people just being on the internet doing whatever they wanted kind of happened while I was in high school. And so by the time I was in college, I was able to go and find these online resources. And I think that that was the way that largely I did it. I think now a lot of people do it through there's a fair amount of like, you know, TikTok influencers and things like that that people theoretically look to. And, I guess with varying degrees of quality of the advice, but that's always been the case. That was the case with books when I was this at this stage in my career. It was the case with online courses when I was at this stage in my career as well. I found that education being very self-directed, and I suspect to some degree it kind of does still need to be.
I think looking at what we're served as, let's say, knowledge from LLMs, for example, that could also work that way. Because if we have zero knowledge on a specific topic and an LLM is serving as a statistically relevant average,
Hmm.
that average is already an improvement of our zero,
Well,
right?
right. I think if you know absolutely nothing, it is likely that whatever the internet consensus is at least better than a random guess. That would be my hope a lot of the time. Maybe not always, but that would be my hope.
Yeah, so that would be also a way to start. But I probably would lean towards finding an actual human being that actually knows things about that specific area, and just at least following them on socials if they are on socials. So, like, I don't know much about LinkedIn. I just follow Richard van der Blom, who's a analyst who analyzes the behavior of LinkedIn and LinkedIn algorithm. So at least I know how to post on LinkedIn because he posts the gold nuggets about creating content for LinkedIn. But do I need that expertise to be as good as him? Probably not, because LinkedIn is not my livelihood.
Right.
But it helps get to my livelihood. It helps me
Right.
secure a job. It helps me find clients. It helps me deliver content or tell people that I'm teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a means for other things. And again, this auxiliary skill, and
Absolutely.
that comes probably to all of these, that we need to find a way that is suited for us to learn those and expand on those.
Right.
Given that I know you're constrained on time, any
Mm-hmm.
last words?
Ooh, last words. Last words.
Last pieces of
Last words.
advice.
Here's okay. So here's what I would say for last pieces of advice is that in this sort of like age of the AI that we find ourselves in, I think a thing that I find myself talking to students about right now a lot is that learning the composition of our brains has not changed a lot. And so, to the extent that these tools are helpful for finding information, that is fantastic. And that if I were to give advice about learning generally right now, the things I would tell students are that spaced repetition is still very useful. Practice, sleep, practice, sleep. Um, Creating a desire for the information before attempting to ingest it is really useful. We talked about that a little bit on here.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, finding information in different learning style formats or creating that information in additional learning style formats is extremely useful for developing not only a knowledge of the thing that you're looking at, but also practicing the skill of applying information from one context to another, which becomes increasingly useful as you advance in seniority in your career.
And conveying information as well
Yeah, absolutely.
later.
Absolutely.
All right. Before we jump off, announcements. So, next week, 16th of July, we're going to be exploring the test-driven development, and we're going to be playing Jitter Ted's TDD game. So that's going to be interesting. That hasn't happened here yet. That we're going to be playing a game live. So we have Ted M. Young, and he's bringing his game, and we're going to be learning test-driven development. And of course, again, if you manage to survive till the end of the stream, visit our website, articles, white papers. Also, all the streams are also there, and events. In the middle, we have the strategic integration design with DDD hosted at Avans Coperta at the moment. We're teaching in class this autumn. And of course, subscribe. You can subscribe by just going and scanning this QR code. It should pop up a message on your phone. Hey, do you want to subscribe to this channel? Da, da, da. So, of course, that's always welcome. You don't have to, but it would be nice. And Chelsea, thank you so much for joining. That was really, really a cool session because I believe that education is very important, and having you to put some light on how we deal with that from all the perspectives. I think that's an important discussion that we should be having more often with people. So thank you for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, and then